Good morning, Michael Alvarez. I'm a professor at the California Institute of Technology, where I am the founding co-director for the Linde Center for Science, Society, and Policy. I'm also one of the co-directors of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. And I'm here today to talk to you about our recent research and the research of some of our colleagues on dealing with election misinformation. This presentation and slide deck is designed to be a guidebook for American election officials. We know that misinformation, election misinformation specifically, is a serious problem in the 2024 presidential election. It's been a serious problem in previous elections here in the United States, and it's also been a serious problem in other elections throughout the world in recent years. We're going to use a relatively broad definition in our research, drawn from the studies of some of our colleagues, where we're going to define misinformation as information that's false or misleading, irrespective of the intention or source. I've had the great fortune over the past couple of months to have many conversations with election officials and other stakeholders. Those conversations are included in my Office Hours webinar series, and those are also included in a Spotify podcast. You can find links to the webinars and the podcast on our website at protectingtheelection.us. In those conversations, I've talked to election officials about their current concerns about election misinformation, what they're doing to try to counter the election misinformation that is affecting their work and their jurisdiction, as well as their concerns about election misinformation moving forward through the remainder of this election cycle. They have many concerns about misinformation regarding the administration of the election technologies, and election procedures. There have also been reports from other organizations, including Microsoft and other branches of the United States federal government, that have presented systematic evidence that there are misinformation campaigns that are being conducted by well-funded foreign adversaries that are being targeted specifically at American voters, as well as attacks that are aimed at American election infrastructure and the campaigns themselves. Surveys that we've conducted, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, have shown that at this point, many Americans believe in these more salient election misrumors and components of misinformation. This has been going on for some time, and I'll talk about some of the recent survey data that we've collected with respect to American beliefs about election misinformation. We've also put together a database of many of the common stories and myths and rumors and misinformation about American elections, which will be shortly available on our website at protectingtheelection.us. Examples of election misinformation abound. These are three that come from the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. One of these is that election officials don't clean voter rolls. That's clearly false. Another is that drop boxes used by election officials to collect returned mail-in absentee ballots can be easily tampered with, stolen, or destroyed, which is also untrue. A third is that voting system software is not easily reviewed or tested and can be easily manipulated. That's also not true. If you want details about why these three and the others are not true, please visit the CISA website. The issue, though, is that a simple search on any social media platform right now, today, of these kinds of rumors, myths, and misinformation will reveal that they are still being discussed in various forms on social media, online, and among many voters, stakeholders, and others throughout the world. So the issue, of course, is that despite the fact that many of these types of misinformation are clearly not true and have been systematically refuted, they still are floating around and are still part of the information ecosystem of the 2024 presidential election. Now, in the 2024 election cycle, as we go into the final stages of this election, survey work that we have done has found that many American registered voters believe that election fraud is very common or that it occurs occasionally. This is data from a paper by myself and Mitchell Lingar. Mitchell is a PhD student here at Caltech who's helping me and is leading much of the research that we're doing on election fraud and misinformation this fall. What we found in this survey, which is a survey of 2,211 U.S. registered voters who were interviewed in the last few weeks, last week of June and first week of July, interviewed online. And these data are weighted so that the opinions should reflect the opinions of the national population of U.S. registered voters. We studied a number of different election misconceptions, ranging from mail ballot fraud to official tampering with election materials. And we find, as you see here in the pink, that between a third and about 4 out of 10 Americans believe that these types of election fraud occur very commonly or that they occur occasionally. This again is a misconception because these kinds of election fraud are very rare in the United States, and they do not occur commonly or even occasionally. So this forms the background for much of our research, which is that many American registered voters believe in these types of election misinformation. Now, the issue here is that unless we prevent or refute election misinformation, it has serious downstream consequences. Election misinformation can corrode confidence and trust in election administration. Studies have shown that there's a correlation between belief in election fraud and election manipulation and low trust and low confidence in U.S. elections. It can also lead to issues with respect to the legitimate transfer of power. We saw that January 6, 2021. Second, targeted misinformation campaigns can mislead and disenfranchise eligible voters. Misinformation campaigns about very specific components of the election process, for example, dates and locations of where ballot return facilities are available, about where to vote, about polling places, about vote centers. That kind of targeted misinformation can lead people to have trouble either finding the right place to vote or perhaps trying to vote in the incorrect place or at an incorrect time or mark their ballot in an incorrect way, all of which can disenfranchise those voters. So election misinformation is a very significant problem, and it's something that, as we get into the closing days of this election, we need to continue and ramp up our efforts to deal with it. Now, there are two common strategies for dealing with misinformation. One is to deal with it after it is spread. This is called debunking or fact-checking. It's a common tactic that's used by election officials. And the good news is that research shows that it works. There's a resource that I'll provide a citation to at the end of this presentation called the Debunking Handbook that goes through much of the academic research that shows that debunking works and shows how it can work. The other strategy is to try to counter misinformation before it spreads, which is called pre-bunking or inoculation. This is a newer tactic and a less commonly used tactic. However, research is showing that it works and that it might work better than pre-bunking or fact-checking. Our research, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, shows that it can work to stop the spread of election misinformation and perhaps help improve confidence and trust in the election process. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about debunking election misinformation. It's something that many election officials are currently doing, and it is a tactic that we encourage election officials to continue to do as we move into the final stages of the 2024 presidential election. Now, in the past, many research groups, including mine at Caltech, we've really helped to work in the background to help build facts and arguments for election integrity. So we've helped provide the factual basis for debunking election misinformation. A good example is a project that we ran in 2020, where our research group was getting voter files from the state of California and two of the larger counties in the state, Orange County and Los Angeles County, and doing very systematic and detailed studies to analyze the accuracy and integrity of those data. We found that these files had a high degree of integrity and were quite accurate. And the steps that we took to help uncover the issues that we did find were immediately provided as actionable intelligence back to the election officials. And they took steps, right, to again improve the quality and accuracy of their voter registration databases. So going back to this misconception that election officials do not clean voter rolls, that is false, because not only do they do things to help improve the accuracy of voter rolls, they enlist the help of experts like my research group and others to try to help provide improvements and to clean those voter registration rolls as we move into important election cycles like 2020 and 2024. So if you're an election official, how do you talk to an election disbeliever or someone who believes very strongly in one of these misconceptions, myths, or some type of misinformation about elections? So it's a kind of scenario that I've heard over and over this fall during the conversations I've had with election officials throughout our country. An example would be an election official, say, who's at a community event or is working in their office and someone comes into the front desk. This individual is convinced in the truth of a clear falsehood about how elections are conducted in your jurisdiction. One example that we've heard quite frequently over the last couple of years is that there are some who believe that provisional ballots are only counted when elections close. I can tell you that's not true. I have seen it myself, and I've seen how election officials deal with all provisional ballots that get returned to them. And election officials will tell you, if you ask them or if you look at the information on their websites, that they actually examine all provisional ballots and include those that are eligible to be included in the tabulation after the election, irregardless of how close an election is. But if you're an election official, what do you do in this situation? Again, as I said before, there's good news because there's considerable work about debunking and talking to disbelievers. This is a figure from a recent paper from my colleague Sander van der Linden. It's in a paper that is available online, and you can go and read this paper. I recommend that you do. It's a wonderful resource on both debunking and pre-bunking misinformation. What Sander argues is that there are some clear best practices for debunking. The first would be, in this kind of situation, that you argue the facts. You let the disbeliever know that, for example, in the last election, there were X number of provisional ballots that were completed and returned, and that we examined all of them, and that we included some proportion, whatever that number is, giving them the exact fact, in our tabulation after we verified that they were actually from eligible voters who had not cast a ballot in some other way. Provide them the clear facts in this situation. Now, secondly, if when they talk to you, you can hear in their argument that there's some myth behind it, or there's also some sort of manipulation technique that's being used. You should also take additional steps to warn them about the myth, why it's important that they not believe in this particular myth or rumor, why it's important that they understand the actual facts, and why it's important that they communicate the facts, again, here, about how all provisional ballots are examined, and those eligible to be included in the tabulation are. If you hear that there's some kind of conspiracy theory or some other manipulation technique that's being used, you should also try to explain how and why the myth is misleading, in particular, if it's embedded within some type of conspiracy theory. Finally, return to the facts. You should reiterate the facts, reinforce them, and provide a credible alternative explanation for the misinformation or the rumor. This takes time, it takes patience, but if you engage in this kind of reasonable conversation with a disbeliever or someone who believes in a falsehood, you can effectively persuade them or get them to reconsider their belief in the falsehood. So give them the facts. Again, in this particular situation about provisional balloting, tell them the exact numbers of provisional ballots that were returned and how many of those were included in your jurisdiction's tabulation. Warn about the myth. Set the record straight about provisional ballots. Talk about why it's important as a fail-safe method to give eligible voters the opportunity to cast a vote if there's something wrong with their registration information. Persuade them that they need to understand and they need to tell others that provisional voting is a secure and meaningful component of the election process in your jurisdiction. Expose the technique if you can see the technique behind it. For example, there are people who want to cast doubt on the use of provisional ballots in our elections in our area. They do this for different reasons, ranging from trying to denigrate the integrity of our elections to trying to have people doubt whether the provisional ballot that they may have to cast might be counted. Make sure that you dig into the technique if you can see that there's a technique behind the misinformation. Finally, reinforce the facts. Tell them again that we count all provisional ballots from eligible voters who have returned their ballot in some way, who have not returned a ballot in some other way. Make sure that they understand the facts, make sure that they understand the data, and reiterate and reinforce the facts in this situation. Lee McIntyre has written a really wonderful book published in 2021 about talking to science disbelievers. As I read the book, there are 3 other tips that I thought would be helpful for election officials to learn. One is that disbelief is a spectrum. There's no doubt that there are some people who will be very adamant and very strong in their beliefs about some sort of election misinformation or denial. And you know, it's going to your ability to persuade them that they should not buy in to the misinformation or rumor. You know, it's going to depend upon the particular rumor or myth. It's going to depend upon the person and the strength of their beliefs, and it's going to depend on the context. Sometimes it's going to be easier to persuade some people than others. Some people will have very malleable opinions. Others will be very fixed. Be persistent, but remember that some are going to be harder to persuade than others. Remember also that everything is amplified on social media. So election disbelievers and people who are spreading misinformation will use social media to make their opinions heard and to amplify them. Our recommendation is to engage with disbelief where you encounter it. So if you encounter it on social media, engage on social media. Finally, be patient and persistent. Repeat the facts, repeat the importance of the facts, try to dispel conspiracy theory. Don't give up, be patient. And, you know, again, research indicates that if you are patient and persistent and you follow some of the best practices that I've just talked about, you can effectively debunk election misinformation. Now, as I've said earlier, many election officials are already doing debunking and fact-checking. There's a lot of good examples that we've encountered through the course of our studies. And here are 3. The first comes from Orange County, California, where I had a wonderful conversation recently with Bob Page, who is the Register of Voters in Orange County. They've put together a trusted election official information website, which is right off of their website. They have this nice drop-down menu that contains factual information on the rumors that are salient right now in Orange County. Rumors about voting by mail, voter registration, jury duty, vote centers, ballot drop boxes, and remote accessible voting by mail ballots. It's a good example for what you can do as an election official, even now, in the context of the final stages of this presidential election. Another example comes from the Secretary of State's website in California. They have also a trusted info website where they provide facts about the election process and facts about the security of elections in California. It's another great example for how a Secretary of State has put together facts about elections in an effort to debunk rumors that persist in the state of California about the elections process. A third example comes from Maricopa County, Arizona, and I wanted to highlight this because I'll be talking about Maricopa later. Maricopa has a Just the Facts website. I encourage folks to take a look at it because it provides election facts, debunks election myths, has voter information and education materials, And it also has a comprehensive report that sets the record straight about the administration of the 2020 election in Maricopa County. Again, another really wonderful example of efforts by election officials to get the facts out there, to debunk election myths, and to provide as much information as they can about the integrity of the election process in their jurisdiction. Pre-bunking. So what's pre-bunking? There's been a great deal of recent research on the efficacy of what we'll call preemptive approaches to countering misinformation, to quote from some of Sanders' recent work. The idea behind pre-bunking is to deal with misinformation before individuals have been exposed, to effectively inoculate them against the misinformation when they might be exposed to it in the future. So research that we've been doing over the last couple of months has shown that inoculation or pre-bunking can be effective for dealing with election misinformation, and that it appears to have a lasting effect. This is work that's collaborative with Mitchell Liniger, Betsy Sinclair, professor at the Washington University in St. Louis, and Sandra van der Linden, who's a professor at Cambridge University. This paper will shortly be available online. We're going to be submitting it for academic publication in the very near future. So we did a very complicated experiment where we start by asking all of the subjects in our study a series of standard questions on themselves, their demographics, and their partisanship. We ask them about their beliefs in different election myths and facts, and we also ask them about their confidence in the election process. They then get assigned to one of 5 different rumor conditions, and the example I'm going to use here is our voter fraud rumor condition. From there, they get split into treatment and controls. And then comes the interesting part of the experiment. For the voter fraud example, we have found some very powerful media stories about voter fraud that claim that there is actually rampant voter fraud, incorrectly claim that, by the way, and claim to provide facts in support of that. That's what we're going to use as our full exposure article on voter fraud. What we did, though, was we took the full exposure article and we used a large language model to soften that full exposure article into the inoculation dose. So it gets softened, and it also gets some warning information attached to it, so that, again, we soften it and warn, and we make an inoculation dose of the claim. So in this case, those voters who are in the treatment condition get assigned to viewing and reading the inoculation dose, and then they get the full exposure. Those who are in the control get a placebo and get the full exposure. And then we again repeat the post-treatment questions, which are the same questions that we asked them before this treatment process. Then we also, 7 days later, follow up with another survey of these same people and try to understand whether or not their confidence in elections and their belief in some of these election rumors have changed over the past 7 days. So here's an example of the inoculation dose of our voter fraud treatment condition. Again, we took a article that makes the strong claim that voter fraud is rampant, which is false, but it makes that strong claim. And we used AI and a large language model to soften it and warn, to provide the inoculation dose. So that's the process here. So we start the inoculation by telling them that politically motivated actors often attempt to manipulate public opinion about elections by spreading false or misleading information. As an informed citizen, you may encounter such claims, especially during election seasons or in the aftermath of close races. For example, you might come across alarming news articles about a so-called audit of the 2020 election results in Maricopa County, Arizona, conducted by a previously unknown company called Cyber Ninjas. So that's the warning component and transition into the softened inoculation dose. And I am not going to read this, but this page and the next page contain the rest of the materials for the softened version or inoculation dose in the voter fraud condition of our experiment. Here's the second page. This inoculation dose of this and the others that are in our study will be shortly available on our project website at protectingtheelection.us. They can be used by election officials and other stakeholders. If you need them before they're available, please feel free to send us an email using the email address on the website, and we will share those with election officials who may want access to these materials before we put them on our website. So our study indicates that election information pre-bunking works. Interestingly, using a large language model for pre-bunking can be a very important strategy. Part of the reason why we wanted to use a large language model was to demonstrate that this new technology of AI can be used to very quickly and very effectively develop effective pre-bunking arguments for incoming claims about elections. The LLM generated pre-bunking significantly reduced belief in specific election myths and increased confidence in election facts, with these effects persisting for at least a week. Confidence in election integrity was also increased post-treatment. Importantly, the effect was consistent across partisan lines, even when controlling for demographic and other attitudinal factors like conspiratorial thinking. So again, in general, the results of our work suggest that large language model generated pre-bunking is a promising tool for rapidly responding to changing election information narratives. As I said earlier, the pre-bunking materials that we developed for these 5 rumors that we studied here will be shortly available, and anyone who wants them, just send us an email through the project website. We're also willing to help assist election officials who may want us to develop other pre-bunking arguments using this technology. Again, contact us directly using the email address on the project website. Let's talk a little bit about the specifics about what we're finding. So how much does pre-bunking matter for election confidence? One way to focus on how much pre-bunking matters is to examine how the full exposure contrasts to pre-bunking exposure and confidence in the national election. We asked subjects in our sample to provide their assessment of the confidence of integrity of elections at the national level. And here we're going to look at the proportion of those respondents who scored 5 or greater on that 10-point confidence scale. So these are the people who are very confident, the proportion who are very confident. So full exposure is persuasive among the untreated. These are the people who do not receive the inoculation. The proportion of untreated who are confident in the election falls from 68.4% to 63.9% as measured immediately after treatment. However, among those who are inoculated, the proportion confident in the election changes from 69% to 66.2%. So a 4.55 difference is reduced to 2.8%. What this means is that the LLM generated pre-bunking inoculation article prevents about 1/3 of the subjects from being persuaded against the integrity of the election in the short term. These effects we find, as I've said before, are consistent across party affiliations, but do not persist for 7 days. So what about pre-bunking and belief in each of these rumors? Another way is to focus on how much pre-bunking matters is to examine how full exposure contrasts to pre-bunking exposure and belief in each rumor. So again, let's consider subjects in our study who are likely to believe that a specific rumor is true, right? Who score greater than 5 on this 10-point scale of belief in the specific rumor. The proportion of untreated, those who don't receive the inoculation, who believe in the specific rumor increases after full exposure in our study from 44.2% to 48.8%. However, the proportion of treated subjects, those who are exposed to the inoculation dose, who believe in the specific rumor falls after pre-bunking from 44.6% to 43.3%. These treatment effects are consistent across party affiliations and persist after 7 days. So what's our advice for election officials about pre-bunking? Our research shows that it's possible for election officials to warn people about misinformation, to develop weakened versions of that misinformation using large language models, and to then help the people develop an immunity to misinformation. As we've shown here, this can help increase people's willingness to believe in fact and improve their overall confidence in election administration. These effects can last for at least a week, though we recommend continued efforts to ensure their long-term effectiveness. Importantly, we've shown that AI and large language models can help develop these inoculation arguments, which means that they can be developed at scale and rapidly when they're needed, when there are new election rumors, election falsehoods, and types of misinformation that you're encountering. This paper will be available shortly online as soon as we get it under peer review. And these materials that are associated with the paper will also be available online. As I've said before, any election official who is interested in talking further about how to implement these ideas on pre-bunking should get in touch with us immediately using the email address on our project's website. I'll put this slide deck on our project website. We have a number of additional suggested resources. These are the things that I've discussed in this presentation. I encourage you, if you're interested in further reading the scientific work that is behind a lot of what I've talked about here today, to take advantage of these resources, and also take advantage of the resources that are referenced in each of these websites, research articles, and books. Finally, I wanted to acknowledge that our research project is supported by a research grant to Caltech from the John Randolph and Dora Haynes Foundation. This work is also supported by Caltech's Linde Center for Science, Society, and Policy. The research reported here, as I've noted before, is the work of a collaboration between Professor Sander van der Linden, University of Cambridge, Professor Betsy Sinclair, Washington University in St. Louis, and Mitchell Lininger, who's a PhD student here at Caltech. We've also had quite a bit of production and promotional assistance that were provided by Sabrina Haymeister at Caltech and Michelle Schaefer from Magenta Sage Strategies, and we thank them. Again, our project website is https://www.protectingtheelection.us. You can also scan the QR code if you want to go to our website and learn more about our project. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you find the advice and research presented here helpful as you engage in your work as we close out this election cycle. Thank you.